But as you said, I'm Dustin Byrd. I'm calling in from Michigan. I wish I could be there with you. I rarely give up an opportunity to go to the UK, but unfortunately, I couldn't make it there today. But we have this wonderful thing called Zoom, so I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is this concept of the catechon, which comes from St. Paul's, one of his early epistles. And before I do that, I want to say a little bit about the background in why I'm studying this political theology in Russia. And it really began in 2003, 2004, when I was still in grad school. I was going to the Crimea every other year with my doctor father, who's now 95 years old. He fought in World War II in the German side, and I had to learn Russian because nothing would upset the Russians more than having this German get upset with him and yell at him. So I had to learn Russian and so I could get around and talk to people. But we kept going there from 2003 up to 2014, which was the last time we were there. And in 2004, there was a presentation by a professor from Moscow who was talking about a colleague of his in Moscow State University who had become quite influential within the Russian military. And his name, of course, was Alexander Dugin. And we were expecting some kind of military talk, strategies, geopolitics, but he started to talk about theology. And that's not something that you generally hear within military studies. So that's what sparked my interest originally with Alexander Dugin. I kind of put him on the back burner, read a few things, and came back to him later when in 2017 I found myself at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Some of you remember that happening. I wasn't there because I knew what was going on. I happened to be on family vacation in Virginia at the time. And we were up at Thomas Jefferson's house in Monticello, and we went down to Charlottesville for dinner that night, and we were told that this largest Klan and neo-Nazi rally was going to be taking place the next day. Little did we know that it was actually going to start the night we were there with the Tiki Torch Parade. One of the things that they were chanting was, "Russia is our friend." And it was very interesting because, I work in a milieu where I have a lot of good leftists around me all the time. I predominantly would find myself more on left of things. And they still have very much a nostalgia for the Soviet Union and kind of this blind spot for the rightward trend of modern Russia. And so when you would hear these far-right organizations in groups saying Russia is our friend, it was, of course, very interesting to figure out what they were talking about. And as I was researching a book on the alt-right as a form of neo-fascism or alt-fascism, if you will, it came across a lot of commentaries and writings on Alexander Dugin by very prominent far-right folks in America, and then, of course, certainly is the case in Europe as well. And so that led me into returning to Dugan to figure out why he's been so influential in the far-right, and in many cases, he's still more influential in the far-right in the West than he is in Russia itself, although we can always have a debate as to how influential he is in Russia itself. That spectrum goes from he's not influential at all, he's just a quack on the side, to this guy has an amazing amount of influence on what the Kremlin does, including the current war in Ukraine. So as I was researching Dugan again, I came across this category that he constantly is bringing up throughout his writings, although he has never done an extensive study on it, but constantly brings it up as some kind of legitimating factor for the things that the Russian regime at the current moment is doing, and that is this concept of the catechon. So the catechon, as I said before, comes from the Apostle Paul. It's a Pauline concept that has been given life, of course, in the modern period by Carl Schmitt, who we'll talk about in a minute, Hitler's political theologian, and in many ways his court jurist, and Alexander Dugin, the far-right Russian philosopher. We'll examine these three distinct periods upon which the catechon becomes a category within the notion of empire building, at least in the Russian context. Okay, next slide. So in Paul's epistle to the Thessalonians, he's worried about, in many ways, that the community is preparing for the end of the world. Obviously, the first generation of Christians believed that Jesus was going to return in their life. There were plenty of other preachers who were also basically pushing that line of thought. And Paul wanted to warn this community in Thessalonica about this. And he brings in this category that as of right now, biblical studies can't find any type of mention of it prior to the second epistle to the Thessalonians. And this is where he says something like this: "Don't you remember that when I was with you, I used to tell you these things, and now you know that what is holding him back?" Him, of course, would be the Antichrist, right? But this is interesting that he says, what is holding, a thing is holding him back, or that which restrains. That's what the catechon means. So that he may be revealed at the proper time. For the secret power of lawlessness is already at work, but the one who now holds it back, so it went from being a what to an individual, the one who restrains, will continue to do so until he's taken out of the way. And then the lawless one, anomos, will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. So there's two possible things here. So who or what the catechon is very ambiguous. So Tertullian, John Chrysostom, St. Augustine all thought the Roman Empire itself was the catechon, or the one who restrains the Antichrist, restrains lawlessness. Other possibilities from the Orthodox tradition was that as the Orthodox Emperor, possibly the Holy Spirit, the Church itself. John Calvin, for instance, thought it was simply the evangelization of the world. That was the catechon. Ultimately, the category in and of itself, as I said, there's ambiguous and it's open to interpretation, because St. Paul is not clear in this letter as to who or what it is, but it is some kind of thing that's holding back the apocalypse. And he basically tells the community that you ought not to welcome the apocalypse. Yes, it means the second coming of Christ, but at the same time, what it also means is a lot of death and destruction and despair and suffering, and one ought not to be hastily want that, if you will. And therefore, you have to support that which is holding back that lawlessness. And that could be interpreted, again, as the Roman Empire or a Roman emperor themselves, or the Holy Spirit, or whatever it could be. Okay, next slide. This category is taken up later by the jurist called Schmitt, also a theologian. And he takes advantage of the ambiguity of the catechon, making it into a trans-historical concept. So it's not something that is relegated or relevant only to the Roman Empire, but it's something that shows up in each epoch of history. That during the Middle Ages there were catechons, something that was holding back the lawlessness. In the modern period, there are powers that hold back the apocalypse, and so for him, this was what he called his Kernfrage, or his most important question in his entire political theology. For Schmidt, the catechon is not necessarily a religious figure or a religious entity. Anything really can be a delayer of world history, as he calls it. So sometimes he would say the America, which is really interesting, that he actually thought America was a delayer of world history, and that it became eventually an accelerator of world history with the demise of the British Empire, when power around the world shifted to the Americans as opposed to the British, and therefore America became an accelerant in world history. But before that, it was a delayer of world history. And he sees other things like the Byzantine Empire as a catacon, a block against the rise of Islam until, of course, 1453, when the Ottomans take Constantinople. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, and even Hegel, my dear friend Hegel, he calls him the splinter-like fragmentary bearer of the catacon. And scholars interpret that as to mean that Hegel's philosophy in many ways still was animated by a certain level of religiosity, that the Geist of the world was God working through history, although Hegel called it the Geist. And therefore, it wasn't this complete secularization of philosophy that was more endemic to that time. And so even Hegel put the brakes on world history. Now, of course, being that he was the Nazi jurist, he saw the Third Reich as the catacon against Bolshevism, against the deculturalization of Europe, against the destruction of the aristocratic law of nature, as a way of preserving the natural world, as a way of preserving natural order, as a way of preserving the hierarchies of people. Bolshevism would undermine that, just as Christianity undermined the hierarchy of peoples within the Roman Empire. So the Third Reich for catacon, or for the Third Reich was the catacon for Carl Schmitt. Next slide. Now we get to Dugan. So those of you who aren't too familiar with Alexander Dugin as to who he is, he's a far-right Russian philosopher, sociologist, traditionalist. He espouses a political philosophy, or theology, if you will. It's kind of a stretch, but which he calls the fourth political theory. We oftentimes refer to as Neo-Eurasianism, not the original Eurasianism of the early, late 20th century, early 21st century. But this was a form of philosophy, Russian philosophy, that's rooted within the work of German conservatives and fascist thinkers such as Martin Heidegger and Spengler and Karl Haushofer and even Carl Schmitt, of course. And there's some good studies on Dugin's work with Carl Schmitt. Dugan himself has been influenced by the Superfascista Julius Evola and the French Nouveau Droit thinker Alain de Benoit. And then it was Alain de Benoit who introduced Dugan to Carl Schmitt's writings. His work is also predicated on the first Eurasianists, Trubetskoy, Savitsky, Suchinsky, and also Nikolai Danilevsky, who was the author of the book Russia and Europe, very fascinating book that argues that Russia is its own civilization. It is not Europe, it is not Asia, it's Eurasia. It should be treated as its own civilization, respected as its own civilization, and not thought of as an extension of Europe. And if you know Russian history, you know that the background is constantly between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. And obviously, the Eurasianists fall very comfortably on the side of the Slavophiles. So in my analysis, looking at Dugin's work, his philosophy is not a new form of political theory, but it's rather a Russian iteration of what Roger Griffin would define as fascism, or a palingenetic ultranationalist philosophy. Dugan mixes up a species and a genus in terms of what political philosophy is. So he connects fascism close to what Nazism was. Instead of seeing fascism as a political philosophy that enculturates whenever it's in a given culture, given people, whatnot. American fascism is not going to look like British fascism, which is not going to look like Russian fascism or German fascism. They all have their own particular enculturations. And because this Russian form of fascism doesn't look like Nazism, he then separates it and says it's not fascism. It's a completely different political theory. Very few scholars will actually accept that analysis. It is very much a fascist philosophy. Okay, next slide. So, like many ultra-conservative Russians, Dugan views Russia today as the catacon of the age, and that is a responsibility that it has inherited from the position of being the third Rome after the fall of Rome in the 4th century, and then the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. There's the idea that Moscow itself is the third Rome, and therefore it's taken on the responsibility of the catacon to hold back the anomie, the lawlessness of the modern world. So its task is to rescue the world from the Antichrist, whom Dugan positively identifies as the West, the United States in particular. Britain, of course, would be the right hand of the United States as being the satanic West. Thus, the war in Ukraine, when we move here now, the war in Ukraine is Russia's attempt to fulfill its eschatological responsibility. What does that mean? That means that Ukraine is being pulled more and more into the Western sphere of influence. It's westernizing. I saw that the years that I went there, every year, I mean, the amount of investment in change that was happening was very rapid. The corruption was still really bad. I had to bribe a police officer just to park a car once when I was in the Crimea. But the change was happening very quickly in democracy, liberalization, everything that animated the Maidan protests in 2014. All of that for Dugan was a sign that Ukraine, and thus Kiev, the mother of all cities, mother of all Russian cities, was falling under the sway of the West, falling under the sway of Satan, under the sway of the Antichrist. And so that was unthinkable for Dugan that the heartland of the Rus, Kiev itself, would be under the amophorion, if you will, of Satan. And therefore, if Ukraine were to be integrated into the EU, integrated into NATO, it would be protected by the military of Satan, right? And so this is how he's viewing this. It would be especially disastrous, as I said, since Kiev is the heart of the Rus, of the God-bearing people, as he calls the Russians, and their special mission to protect the world from the apocalypse. Next slide. So in May of 2022, this is just a few months after the war began, Dugan wrote in his essay Apocalyptic Realism this very interesting couple paragraphs here. He said, either this area of the world will come under the amophorium of Christ and his Immaculate Mother, or it will remain under the dominion of Satan. He's talking about Ukraine, who will immediately strengthen his dominion over what is, in fact, the cradle of our Russian statehood, church, and culture, our people. The fight for Donbass or Odessa or Kiev and even for Lviv is part of the great eschatological battle. Reality precedes dreams, including imperial eschatological dreams. The era of materialism, economics, rational analysis, experts, technocrats, managers is over. That's us. That's the West. Ideas are returning to the world. This is what he calls pneumakia, or the war of ideas. So he goes on to write, and this is very interesting. He says, and the main battle from now on unfolds between them, right? Ideas versus the era of materialism, right? Between the Russian idea, the Ruski Mir, as it's called, this great all-encompassing idea of the Russian civilization as being one civilization with one identity, things like this is the Ruski Mir. So between the Russian idea, the catacon, the Orthodox civilization, and the world of the Western Antichrist coming at us. It is not us Russians who need Ukraine, it is Christ who needs it. And that is why we are there. And that is why we are not leaving it. So I ask myself always, why does Christ need Ukraine, right? I mean, because if we think of, you know, this is some kind of legitimating ideology that Putin in some kind of ways has taken upon himself to legitimate his own actions in. It would seems to me that it goes back to this claim that without Ukraine, without Belarus, without Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, without the former Russian territories that had conquered and annexed in World War II, and before that the Russian Empire, without that it is not an empire. Without being an empire, it cannot adequately counterbalance or fight off the West, to fight off the apocalypse. And so therefore it has to have the empire back. Now, a lot of us who study Russia, we already think of Russia as an empire posing as a nation state. But for Putin, the entire Ruski Mir must be under the dominion of Moscow. And therefore Ukraine was obviously the most important place to go other than settling Georgia. But then after that, it was Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and moving on. So in order to recreate the Russian Empire, in order to counterbalance the West, the Satanic Empire, it had to invade. That's why none of us were surprised that it invaded Russia when it did, having seen a lot of this ideology animate a lot of the idea manufacturing going on within the political or the public sphere in Russia. Okay, next one. Now, by understanding the special military operation, as it's called, as a cataconic mission, Russia's war is transformed from a brutal war of aggression to a soteriological goodwill gesture. What appears as Cain slaying Abel is in fact a brotherly attempt to rescue the soul of Ukraine from eternal damnation. It's a very different way of looking at this. As such, atrocities committed against the Ukrainian people, including mass executions, rapes, kidnapping of children, are all sanctified, as the aggressor has no choice but to resist the advances of the Antichrist in Ukraine. To abandon such a restraining task is to abandon the divinely bestowed responsibilities of the Third Rome. So with that in mind, Dugan has made it very clear in the latest book he published called Talking to the Wolf, which was also made into a documentary. When asked whether or not he would, if he was in charge of Russia, if he was in Putin's place, whether or not he would use nuclear weapons, and he said unequivocally, yes, I would use nuclear weapons. And of course, we all are horrified, and the question is, why would you use nuclear weapons? I mean, once you've gone that route, this is apocalyptic in many ways. He basically says that if Russia loses this war, then it is now the reign of the Antichrist. And if it's the reign of the Antichrist, all is lost, then it simply does not matter if everyone is nuked. So this is the kind of real-world apocalyptic thinking that is tied to nuclear destruction. Now, again, this brings us into the question is how much influence does he have on Putin? I'm hoping it's little, but you see the constant language and arguments and things that have been developed by Dugan. You see it over and over and over again, increasingly in these last few years in Putin's speeches. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's reading Dugan or something like that, but I think Dugan's influence is more metapolitical as opposed to a direct pipeline to Putin. So.